Applications and separations of the Moon. Planetary speed. The fact that the different planets have different nature is one of the cornerstones of the traditional astrology. These differences are expressed through a variety of factors, like planetary quality, visible color of planetary light, rulership over zodiacal signs, natural affinity to seasons and climate, sect, benefic and malefic disposition, significations, etc. One of the main factors to classify the planets is their speed or sidereal cycle, which is the time the different planets need to get to the same zodiacal degree. The information on the sidereal cycle period and average daily speed of planets is summarized as follows. The sidereal cycle of Saturn takes 29 years, 5 months and 13 days. Its average daily speed is 2 minutes and 1 second. The sidereal cycle of Jupiter takes 11 years, 10 months and 18 days. Its average daily speed is 4 minutes and 59 seconds. The sidereal cycle of Mars takes 1 year, 10 months and 22 days. Its average daily speed is 31 minutes and 27 seconds. The sidereal cycle of the Sun takes 1 tropical year, or 365 days, 5 hours and 48 minutes. The average daily speed of the Sun is 59 minutes and 8 seconds. The sidereal cycle of Venus and Mercury is approximately 1 tropical year. Their average daily speed is 59 minutes and 8 seconds. The sidereal cycle of the Moon takes 27 days, 7 hours and 43 minutes. Its average daily speed is 13 degrees, 10 minutes and 36 seconds. This shows that the Moon is around 13 times faster than the Sun and 392 times faster than Saturn. It is of no surprise that such differences in speed will induce great differences in the influence over terrestrial matters. The criterion of planetary speed is used for the classification of the planets known as Chaldean order, starting from the slowest planet and ranking the planets in increasing order of their speed. The Chaldean order of planets is Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and Moon. In traditional astrology, connections between planets are considered initiated and completed by the faster celestial body. As a rule, Saturn, being the slowest planet, does not make connections, but is being connected by other planets. In the same way, Mars connects only to Jupiter and Saturn, being slower in their motion compared to Mars. The only exception here is when a planet is stationary or retrograde in its motion. In case Mercury, being the second in speed after the Moon, is stationary at a certain moment, only then it might turn out that Saturn moves faster, so it could make connection to the temporary slowed down Mercury. Given the fact that the Moon is always direct in motion, it is the Moon that applies and separates from the rest of the planets, not contrariwise. Applications and separations of the Moon. The applications and separations of the Moon is a specific technique applicable only to the Moon and the contacts it makes with other planets. This technique is different to the concept of aspects, because in aspects planetary rays touch planetary bodies, allowing interaction between the planetary influences. Whereas, with its applications and separations, the Moon absorbs the light of the planets and charges up with it, activating the respective planetary influence in the life of the native. The Moon can be applying or separating to a planet physically, also known as bodily, or by its ray. Application is when the Moon approaches the degree of the planet, whereas separation is when it passes over the degree of the planet, both bodily or with its ray. Since the Moon is always direct in motion and the fastest celestial body, it will always first make an application to a planet, followed by a separation, when it passes over its degree. The applications and separations do not respect sign boundaries. There can be out-of-sign applications, whereas there cannot be out-of-sign aspects, which again points out the differences between the two concepts. The application is initiated when the Moon is within 15 degrees to a planet, both bodily or by aspect, and completed or perfected when the Moon reaches the exact degree of a planet. The separation is initiated and perfected when the Moon passes over the degree of a planet, again both bodily or by aspect, and after that it slowly fades away. The applications and separations of the Moon technique is a simple predictive technique based on the perfected motion of the moon after the birth. This technique is less dependent of tropical and sidereal zodiac because it studies the interval of 30 degrees from the natal position of the moon, regardless of sign boundaries. All applications and separations of the moon describe the general dynamics of the native's life, depending on the nature of the planet to which the moon has been in contact. The technique includes all applications and separations, both bodily and by ray, initiated and perfected by the moon within 30 degrees after its natal position, in the same sign or in the next. In addition to this, the last separation the moon made before reaching its natal position, corresponding to the birth of the native, could also be considered. The applications and separations become effective within certain ranges, as the 30-degree interval is subdivided into 4 different parts corresponding to the 4 stages of human life. The tightest range is within 3 degrees and it corresponds to the early life of the native, possibly childhood. All applications and separations of the moon within this interval should be examined in connection to possible events early in life. The second range is from 3 to 7 degrees and it corresponds to the period of life that comes after the childhood. All applications and separations of the moon within this interval should be examined in connection to possible events in life during adolescence. The third range is from 7 to 15 degrees and it corresponds to the period of life that comes after adolescence. All applications and separations of the moon within this interval should be examined in connection to possible events in life during adulthood. The last range is from 15 to 30 degrees and it corresponds to the period of life that comes last. All applications and separations of the moon within this interval should be examined in connection to possible events in life at old age. Example: the moon is at 5 degree Taurus, Mercury at 3 degree Gemini, Venus at 8 degree Taurus, the Sun at 6 degree Gemini, Mars at 6 degree Capricorn, Jupiter at 12 degree Cancer, and Saturn at 22 degrees Sagittarius. The moon has already perfected a separation from the trine ray of Saturn within 13 degrees before its natal position, which is the last separation made before birth. Since at the time of birth the moon is only 1 degree before the trine ray of Mars, and the range of application is 15 degrees, the application to the trine ray of Mars, perfected within 1 degree, is to be considered the first application of the moon which should be studied. Then, within 2 degrees, it separates from Mars and makes a physical application to Venus, perfected within 3 degrees. The application to Venus takes precedence to the separation from Mars. Within 4 degrees, the moon separates from Venus and makes an application to the sextile ray of Jupiter, perfected within 7 degrees. Within 8 degrees, it separates from Jupiter, but since the distance to Mercury is 20 degrees, the moon will enter the range of a physical application to Mercury 5 degrees after the perfection of the separation from Jupiter. So the application to Mercury takes precedence over the separation from Jupiter within 13 degrees and is perfected within 28 degrees, followed by a separation from it in the last 2 degrees until it reaches the limit of 30 degrees from its natal position. The moon makes neither application nor separation to the Sun and Saturn, because while in the sign of Taurus, the moon is in aversion to Gemini and Sagittarius, where the Sun and Saturn are located. When the moon enters the sign of Gemini, it initiates an application to the Sun, but since it can be perfected 1 degree after the end of the 30-degree interval, this application should not be considered. No application to Saturn is initiated since the range of application is 15 degrees, which is less than the distance between the last degree of the interval and the position of Saturn. Theoretical explanation. The concept of applications and separations is based on the color of the planets to which the moon is applying or separating. According to the classical optical theory, each planet throws off an efflux of light particles or rays of colored light with a specific color associated with it. The moon reflects the sunlight, so it has no efflux or color of its own, and the sunlight is understood as translucent or transparent, as a kind of luminosity. Furthermore, each planet can range from being translucent in accordance with its own color, meaning that the color of its efflux or rays is pure and brilliant, to lacking in clarity or brightness of that color. The purity of the color will relate to a benefic effect of the planet, whereas the muddiness of the color will relate to a malefic effect. When the moon is applying to a planet, it takes on the efflux of that planet and then discharges that efflux down to the terrestrial world. This is a power unique to the moon, for which reason the moon is regarded as universal. Because the moon moves so quickly and is capable of so many variations in terms of waxing and waning in its different phases, it is considered capable of assuming or taking on the effluxes of all planets. The lunar application to a benefic is for the most part benefic, and to a malefic for the most part malefic, because the moon is taking on the characteristic efflux of the planet. The applications give judgment on the things that are going to be and those that are hoped for. The lunar separation from any planet is regarded malefic, because when the moon is separating from a planet, the planet is deprived of its translucency or its transparency and of its connection with the sun, left without direction and therefore causing bad things for the native. Because the nature of the moon is to reflect and turn back the translucent solar light, after separation with the planet, it reflects its translucency, leaving it muddy, corrupted, and capable of malefic influences. The separations give judgment on the things that have preceded and have been preserved. When the moon is separating from one planet and applying to another, this provides a kind of connection between two planets, a transition from one nature to another. Specific attention should be paid to the moon if the moon is void of course. This is a special condition of the moon compared to moving towards nothing, moving towards the vacuum, or drifting without direction. We say that the moon is void of course when it joins no planet, either bodily or by aspect, within the next 30 degrees, regardless of sign boundaries. The above definition makes the void of course moon very uncommon, because it allows the interval of 30 degrees for perfection of the moon. However, there are different variations of the definition which narrow down this interval or respect sign boundaries. The most popular medieval definition of void of course moon is almost identical, with the requirement that it counts for all applications and separations of the moon, both bodily or by ray, within the borders of the sign, but not beyond that. In practice, this means that often when a person is born with moon and the last few degrees of the sign, it will be a case of void of course moon. Here, obviously, we have a mix of the concept of applications and separations, which does not respect sign boundaries, and the concept of aspects, configured only between signs and within sign boundaries. Another variation of the original definition is that the interval for applications and separations is not 30 degrees, but 13 degrees, which also makes the void of course moon more common. Here, we have a mix of the concept of applications and separations and the concept of the daily motion of the moon around 13 degrees. Both concepts emerge later in the tradition and do not respect the specific characteristics of the concept of applications and separations, for which void of course moon is linked and represents one of the four possible cases of the moon: application, separation and application, separation, none of the three when the moon is moving towards nothing. Delineation principles. There are several types of delineations which survived antiquity, mainly by Firmicus Maternus in Book 4 of his Matheseus Libri Octo, including delineations of the moon applying to a planet, the moon separating from a planet and applying to another planet, the moon separating from a planet, and the moon being void of course. These delineations correspond to the above four possible cases of the moon. Applications and separations have to be delineated separately for the different range of degrees and periods of life, because it does not make sense to delineate the moon applying to one planet earlier in life and then applying to another later, because those correspond to two completely different periods of life. The ranges of application and separation have nothing to do with strength of the connection, but they give us a general timing. The applications and separations of the moon within the above intervals will describe the main tonality of the native's life at the period in question. The basic delineations consider whether the moon is of the sect in favor and in which phase it is. The delineation would be more positive if the waxing moon is applying or separating from a diurnal planet, and if the waning moon is applying or separating from a nocturnal planet. Also, the applications and separations of the moon do not depend on the type of the connection with the planet. The application of the moon to a planet is to be delineated in the same way regardless if it is a bodily conjunction or application with a ray from a trigon or a diameter. The void of course condition is regarded mostly negative because none of the planetary energies gets activated in the life of the native, which by itself is considered sluggish, non-productive, undistinguished, lacking in advancement, and incapable to achieve good fortune. General delineation rules. First, one must check the sign where the moon is, the sign it leaves, and the sign it enters. Signs are particularly important because even though applications and separations of the moon do not respect sign boundaries, the rays of planets are active within sign boundaries, and the change of sign leads not only to overall change of environment and rulership, but also to change of connections between planets. Second, within sign boundaries, the respective bound where the moon is should also be observed, together with the bound it leaves and the bound it enters. Third, next thing to check is if the ruler of the sign or bound aspects the moon and from what house. Carefully observe the condition of the planets to which the moon is making applications or separations, their courses and phases, power of the houses and signs they are situated in, but also compare the nature of the signs and the quality of the houses. Fourth, if the moon is situated in the last 2 degrees of a sign, it does not indicate anything, because it is limited by the sign it is meeting. When the moon is in the first 2 degrees of a sign and separating from no planet, then only the effect of the aspects in the new sign must be considered. All the power of the sign the moon has just passed through is left behind at the boundary which is between signs, and another meaning is allotted in the first degree of the next sign. Fifth, in general, we deal with signs as a whole. However, in our work we have to deal also with details, which comes from bounds and exactness of applications and separations. Sixth, the effect of an application is introduced when the moon is within 15 degrees to a planet, both bodily or by aspect. Within 3 degrees this effect becomes dominant. Seventh, the effect of a separation is introduced when the moon passes over the degree of a planet, both bodily or by aspect. The application is perfected on the exact degree of the planet. The separation is perfected on the degree following the degree of the planet. 8. The effect of each application and separation is exhausted with the next application or separation the moon makes. 9th. When you study applications and separations of the moon, take into account the whole body of information and put all connections to planets in the order of their occurrence. 10th. Observe the sign the moon enters in the third place, the sign that follows the sign after the natal position of the moon, and its ruler, that also has power in the forecast. Conclusion. The applications and separations of the moon is a fundamental predictive technique that provides information of the major planetary influences in the different stages of the life of the native. The technique puts the moon at the center due to its unique ability to reflect the light of other celestial bodies and to discharge it down to the terrestrial world. The applications and separations of the moon are not to be mistaken with aspects, because they suggest different type of connection between the moon and the planets based on the perfected motion of the moon after birth, regardless of sign boundaries. This interval of 30 degrees from the natal position of the moon is divided in 4 parts, corresponding to the different stages of life, and applications and separations of the moon should be delineated in relation to their timing in the life of the native. The other most important condition to be considered include sect of the chart and phase of the moon.